Poor connection. She is.
Hi, I'm Otto Penzler. I'm in my office at the Mysterious Bookshop, and we're going to talk a little bit about collecting again today. Last week I talked about Philo Vance and S.S. Van Dyne, and today we're going to talk about a somewhat more recent writer, an old friend of mine, Sue Grafton. Sue came to the bookshop for her second book, when she and Sarah Paretsky, two names that are always linked, the way Hammett and Chandler are, the way Christie and Sayers are, Paretsky and Grafton are always linked. They both came out with their first hard-boiled book in 1982. Sue did not tour for that first book, but she came with Bees for Burglar for the second book. Her series, you probably know, unless you've been living on Mars, is a very famous series known as the Alphabet series, beginning with A, and the plan was to finish with Z, and she said she wouldn't go beyond Z. Unfortunately, she died 3 years ago, having finished Y. And so to all the Sue Grafton fans, the alphabet ends with 25 letters. Her character is Kinsey Millhone, who is a private eye in a made-up town called Santa Teresa, which is a fictionalized version of Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara is where she lived and where Ross MacDonald, Kenneth Miller, whose pseudonym was Ross MacDonald, also lived, and he was the great influence on her work. She became a mystery writer. She'd been writing films, mostly television movies, but also theatrical release. The Lolly Madonna Wars. She wrote the screenplay based on her own novel. But she turned to detective fiction when she decided that she didn't like writing for screenplays. She didn't like working as part of a group. She wanted to write her own thing, and turned to detective fiction because her dad had been a detective fiction writer, C.W. Grafton, and she dedicated her first book to him. The Kinsey Millhone character was largely based on Sue herself. She liked to say that if she hadn't married young and had children, she could have been Kinsey Millhone. She also said that Kinsey Millhone and she were were a single soul in two bodies, but Kinsey got the better one. So that's a background, and the Alphabet series is one of the most collected series of books, and she is one of the most collected writers of the last, I'm going to say, century. And I happen to have in the store at this time a tremendous collection. I bought a couple of collections of good books, including people who collected Sue Grafton and collected seriously. So I'm going to just pull these down. Oh, they happen to be next to me. As I said, the first book is A is for Alibi, and here's a very rare advanced proof copy of the first book. It's just plain wrappers. There's nothing fancy about it. But as a result, it was the first novel. It's unusual for these to be printed in large numbers, and it wasn't, so it's quite rare. And this copy happens to have a long inscription from Sue to a friend of hers. The first book looks like this. And it's also inscribed. And here's how you tell a first edition. If you remember, if you tuned in last week, if you were interested in S.S. Van Dyne at all, I showed you on the copyright page that Scribner used an A to distinguish its first printing from its later printings. But Holt and many other publishing companies, particularly in the last 40, 50 years, used a different system. And what it was is a group of numbers, a line of numbers on the copyright page. And the way to distinguish the first printing is to look for the number 1. And there it is. And the reason they do this is it's very simple to adjust the plates when they reprint. All they do is scratch off the 1, and then the list begins with number 2, and that's how you know it's a second, third, fourth printing, etc. Just a word on edition. When I do the cataloging of rare books here in the store. When I use the words first edition, it is slightly inaccurate because I understand as a collector myself, and most collectors do understand this. It's a first edition is also the first printing. It's an edition is all the copies of a book that are printed from that typesetting. So if I showed you this book with no 1, it started with number 2, it would still be a first edition, but it's a second printing. And collectors care about the first printing. I see it's not uncommon for me to find people calling me saying, hey, I have a first edition of A is for Alibi or B is for Burglar. Are you interested? And I immediately say, look at the copyright page and see if the line of numbers begins with the number 1. And they said, no, there's no number 1. It starts with number 4. I said, well, that's a fourth printing. That it's first printing, or a bookseller does if he's describing a book properly. The second book, B is for Burglar, also came out in very plain, simple wrappers, also very scarce because, at this point, Sue was not a big bestseller, and so these advanced galleys were sent out in very small quantities, but and the condition is perfect. Also, Sue was very generous about her inscriptions, so and she signed a lot of books. So it's not finding signed books by some writers is very, very difficult because they weren't particularly generous about being out and about and signing books. Sue did a lot of touring. She went to the BoucherCon and other events very commonly, and she would be very generous about signing books. She'd sit there for an hour signing books for people. Again, this copy is just signed, and this is an interesting phenomenon in recent years. I would say before about 1975, 1980 or so, it was extremely uncommon to find a mystery writer, and indeed most writers, with books that were simply signed. They were almost always inscribed. And so for mystery writers in particular, they weren't toured. Publishers didn't tour a mystery writer, and so there was no opportunity for a writer to sit down and sign stacks of books. Poets sold almost all of their books, except the few big bestsellers and the really famous ones. Most poets sell their books of poetry by doing a reading and selling books at the reading, and so there are many autographed books by poets. But mystery writers, it was very uncommon for them to simply sign books. So the inscribed copies that you would find almost always were to friends or to family. They were mostly presentation copies, books that were presented as a gift rather than just inscribed to somebody that was met in a line. So it's unusual, even for Sue, to find just a signed copy, because mostly she was at events and people would say, hi, I'm a fan, and she would say, oh, what's your name? And she would sign the book for that person. Now we have C is for corpse. They're getting a little, she's selling a little bit better. So now we have a slightly more elaborate cover, as you see. Photo of the author on the back. She was so cute. I just loved her to death. And she's becoming, as I say, more successful. Again, this is inscribed. And there's a copy of C, the first edition of that book. So this is all 3 first editions of her first 3 books, which is pretty hard to find. They're not inexpensive because the early books were printed in fairly small quantities. Each book sold more than the previous one as she became more and more popular. But they were still relatively small quantities until we get to G. And by G, she was selling quite a lot of copies. And then when it got to H, the format was changed to a large format like this. You see the difference in size. And this showed that she was now a big writer. Nowadays, almost all books are printed in this larger size, but that wasn't true in the 80s when Sue was doing these. Excuse me. This book was not signed, but it had a book plate laid in. When Sue wasn't touring, or if she couldn't get to every city in America, although it seemed like she often was, it was not uncommon for her to go to 40 cities to tour. She would so generously send book plates that she'd signed for cities, for bookshops that she couldn't make it to. She was an extremely important writer because it was almost unknown for women to write hard-boiled novels featuring female characters. It was unusual for women to be writing hard-boiled novels at all, but with female series characters was really unusual. And as I said, linked together forever, Kinsey Millhone and Sue Grafton and Sarah Peresky and V.I. Warshawski both came out in 1982 and created a whole new world of collecting. And women customarily did not collect detective fiction. My bookshop opened in 1979, on Friday the 13th, 1979. And because I was a collector, a lot of people who collected mysteries came to the store and we would talk about collecting books. Very few of them were women until Sue Grafton and Sarah Peresky came out with their books. And it's a welcome change. You don't have to be rich to collect. This is a first edition with a book plate laid in, and it's $25. So it's these, on the other hand, are more. They range between $300 and $650. Just letting you know that if you get sophisticated enough to want the early books, you have to save up. This will be seen on YouTube, I'm told. So thank you for tuning in.